Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Prime Minister Carney goes to Washington and the Canada-US relationship goes from it's over, will never be the same again to we're now friends. So it's elbows down and thumbs up. And Pierre Poilievre goes back to Ottawa, and he's given a second chance, but it's going to change the nature of politics. So we are going to yet another political junkie, because I consider myself one as well, and talk with Sean Speer today. He's the editor at large at The Hub, an independent, non-subsidized digital news outlet. You see, I'm getting that in right there because I think it's important. He's also a self-declared policy wonk at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Public Policy Forum, the Monk, you name it. Sean, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great, Senator. I was thrilled to join you after the election, and I'm glad to join you today.
Yeah, we had a really good conversation. For those of you who may have missed it, go back and find it. The morning after the election, Sean Speer, Daryl Bricker, and Trevor Tome, and it was a really good insight to what had gone on and where we're headed. And we're going to do some of the same today. So what do you make of the changed relationship and the visit to Washington and the thumbs up at the end of the meeting?
Yeah, it's I've been thinking a lot about it over the past 24 hours or so, and it seems to me that Prime Minister Carney had two audiences, Senator Wallen. The first, of course, was the president and his administration, and the second is the Canadian public, particularly those who had voted Liberal because of the party's elbows up ethos during the campaign, and the unknown variable was how Trump would receive him. And I think it's fair to say that the vibes, that the kids say, were good. That the two of them had a decent rapport, that Prime Minister Carney struck the balance between being positive and responsive to the president himself, at the same time getting in some of his lines about Canada not being for sale, etc. The only thing I would add to all of that, Senator, is that until the negotiations commence in earnest, the president can have the most favorable impression of how this is going to go. In his mind, the trade deal looks one-sided. But of course, at some point, the Canadian government is going to push back against some of the demands of him and his administration. And it'll be fascinating to see whether he reverts back to the way that he has treated Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Freeland and others, or if there is something different about Prime Minister Carney, that even in the face of these bilateral irritants, he still gives him the type of respect that he did this week.
Yeah, I think that he keeps signaling that. Now, that's always the thing with President Trump, which is he's claiming credit for Mark Carney's victory, that he picked him and he sort of laid on the hands. And so Prime Minister Carney should be thankful in a way. But he does like to surround himself with important people. And perhaps he thinks Mr. Prime Minister Carney's, CV, his resume is more important than Pierre Poilievre's, and so that's the guy he picks.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating part of the meeting yesterday, because there was a question in my mind, I expect in a lot of Canadians' minds, particularly conservatives, whether the president understood that his provocations about Canada being the 51st state were having the type of political reaction that they were. And yesterday, when he said to Prime Minister Carney that he had effectively helped him get elected, it signaled he did know, which prompts the question, if he knew that it was having this effect on the Canadian election environment, why did he keep doing it? Did he indeed want Prime Minister Carney and the Liberals to win? If so, why? If that wasn't the reason, then what was it? Why did he have this aversion or animus towards Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives? I don't have a good answer to those questions, but I think we did learn yesterday that he, in spite of the effect that it was having, or maybe perhaps because of the effect, he kept doing it.
That's where I've gone on this. I mean, lots of people talk about the relationship of Brookfield funding Jared Kushner, and there's a business relationship, but that he also, President Trump, wants to be part of this this larger community where bankers are sort of, someone said, and I think it might have been actually about Justin Trudeau, but it's much more pertinent to President Trump, that he trafficked all his life in the currency of attention.
Yes.
And that's what we see in these Oval Office gatherings where,
Yes.
the media's there, the lights are flashing. He's
Yes.
talking about anything that pops into his mind,
Yes.
the Obama library or the Houthis, he just, and the other person just has to sit and try and manage it.
Yes. Yeah. He has, as some have said, a case of main character syndrome. And the idea that he could have this extraterritorial effect on
Yeah,
our election campaign might have been a temptation that was simply too hard for him
yeah,
to resist. Whatever the motivation, it is self-evident that his threats and provocations changed the underlying conditions of the Canadian election campaign and indeed its outcome. And that matters because, as I said at the outset, Mark Carney is going to have to walk this careful line over the coming weeks and months, in which, on one hand, he has to be conciliatory to the president and the administration because
right.
it is self-evidently in Canada's interest to secure a deal. But he, in effect, won the election by galvanizing Canadians about the need to have our
Yep.
elbows up and reimagine our relationship with the U.S. and so on. And it seems to me that gap between what he has to do and what a lot of voters want him to do is something that won't be easy to broach or bridge. But it's something he's going to have to do because of the uncertainty looming over Canada's economy right now, and the prospect of losing our relatively tariff-free access to the U.S. market is by far the biggest threat to his prime ministership.
Because there was, I've read through I watched it in the first place, then read through the transcripts. I mean, there did seem to be a statement or an indication from the president that he thought this deal was fine. He hated NAFTA, but USMCA was, good. But the tariffs, the clip of the day was, is there anything Mr. Carney can say or do that would change your mind about tariffs? To which he said no.
No.
So he somehow sees those two things as not related.
Yes. And it's like it's worth unpacking for a minute for your audience why the tariffs matter so much. I mean, yes, they obviously matter the extent to which it raises the cost of Canadian exports going to the US market, and ostensibly Canadian business, pardon me, American businesses and consumers will adjust their
Right.
consumption and may move away from Canadian made products. But the real threat, it seems to me, Senator, is that we have a lot of companies operating in Canada that are part of global companies, oftentimes headquartered in the US. And if Canadian exports continue to be subjected to some level of tariff in order to get into the U.S. market, the incentive for them to shift production to the U.S. to effectively jump over that tariff wall will become increasingly powerful. And so it's not just that Canadian exports will be affected on the margins. I mean, the risk is that over time it strips Canada of capital and
Yeah.
production. And that is why it is so important, even if it comes with pretty excruciating compromises, that it is responsibility number one for the Carney government to try to reach some type of arrangement that enables us to restore mostly tariff-free access to the U.S. market.
And we have to do, as people have been saying right from the get-go, as resistant as we may have been to the president's claims, he did sort of state the obvious, which is you guys need to get your own act together and not
Yes.
only pay your defense bills and do that sort of thing and secure the border and think about immigration in a more comprehensive way. But you've got real productivity problems.
Yes.
You've got economic problems. So figure out some way to do it. And that's what we, in fact, do have to do.
Yes, indeed. And you've been following policy and politics for longer than me. And so you'll know that it has been a longstanding policy principle in Ottawa that we ought not to link trade with other issues, that we should
Right.
negotiate trade arrangements in isolation.
Yeah.
Mark Carney has essentially undone that longstanding trade policy principle. He said he's prepared to enter a negotiation of a trade and security agreement, in
Yeah.
effect, linking our access to the U.S. market with action on the part of the Canadian government with respect to border security, defense spending, etc. I think on balance, that's a good idea. Maybe in effect at the table, um, we can get, how would I put it? We can make gains by virtue of doing things we should have done anyway.
This has been the
Uh,
primary American demand since 9/11. Security
yes,
trumps trade, boys and girls. So you
well
have to,
said.
yeah, you have to actually connect the dots.
Well said. I
Yeah,
think that's precisely right. And so in that case, it'll be fascinating to see because open up the to raise the wall of Ottawa policymaking. When Canadian governments are thinking about trade deals, they're thinking about trade-offs between different sectors or different
right.
types of exports. Certain issues are offensive, others are defensive. Do you give up a bit of beef in order to get access more for autos or vice versa or whatever? That is going to be even more complex in a world where now you're also thinking about how does a NORAD fit into this? How does immigration policy fit into this? How does border security and defense? Like the effort on the part of the Canadian government to manage these different issues, all in the name of trying to secure a comprehensive agreement, will represent its own challenges. But I think on balance, it represents opportunities as well. It's a way to, as you say, deal with some of the problems in our own house, and in so doing, hopefully enable that to have us secure the type of access to the U.S. market that our economy so desperately needs.
I want to come to the state of play in Ottawa as well, but let me just first take a look at the what we're seeing happen amongst the premiers, because to Prime Minister Carney's credit, the first thing he did when he got back from Washington or the day after is brief the premiers on this, which is also very inclusive. That was a problem they all had under the previous leadership of Justin Trudeau.
Yes.
So he's including them. But now what we've seen coming forward from the premiers is and Doug Ford, who's their leader, the chair of the premiers meeting, out today saying, "Look, we've got to show Saskatchewan and Alberta some love. We got to deal with Bill 69. We got to get some pipeline activity here and find some other customers and kind of balancing that issue, because what we've been hearing from Danielle Smith is you guys are putting all your eggs in the auto basket. Don't you understand that the energy basket's the one that pays a lot of bills?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well said. Sorry, I was just
Well,
frozen there
so
for a
where do
second.
we go on this? Like, is this going to now become a different it's kind of shifting the focus to that relationship and away from the one that goes on in the House of Commons, where Mr. Poilievre doesn't have a seat yet, but where that has been the focal point for so long, for the last couple of years.
Yeah, such a brilliant question. There's so many layers to it.
Sorry about that.
Conservative. No, 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 no. I mean, on one hand, conservatives are asking themselves tough questions about how to compete and win in national elections after having lost four in a row.
Right.
On the other hand, it can be lost on conservatives that they have dominated provincial politics over the past decade and continue to have
Hmm.
a real presence in our provincial capitals. And so it's interesting to see at the precise moment that the party has lost a federal election, we're seeing a lot of energy on the center right in provincial capitals and almost
Exactly.
provincial conservative governments sort of stepping up to advance and protect the interests of their citizens, particularly those prairie provinces who overwhelmingly voted conservative, but see themselves essentially locked out of the national government.
Right.
Um, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out between the premiers. It kind of reminds me of the state of play with the Trump administration on negotiations. Right now, there aren't real trade-offs
Right.
across the provinces, but when those negotiations commence, one could envision a world where the Carney government is making trade-offs between Quebec dairy farmers, Ontario auto workers, and Western Canadian resources.
Yep.
Um, and in that moment, this temporary expression of unity may not last very long.
No, exactly. I mean, it is, to your point earlier, everybody is declaring this first encounter, as a success. The prime minister did not get Zelensky'd, which has now
Yes.
become a verb. I don't think there was any prospect of that, but you're right. I mean, there's kind of a post-election, let's all give it the good old college try. But the reality of this, these issues and these tensions in this country is very real, and those trade-offs are very real.
Yes.
And the prospect of having to put export controls on energy or some such issue, this is fraught.
Yes. And I think it comes to a broader point in a way, if you'll permit me.
Yep.
Um, we both talked to a lot of conservatives in the country. I think one mistake a lot of conservatives made prior to the election was taking for granted that Mark Carney was a kind of naive neophyte, a wonky
The
egghead.
rookie, rookie
Yes,
politician. Yeah.
and I think he has demonstrated over and over again that he's far shrewder
Mm.
than many of those people anticipated. One of the shrewdest things he did during the campaign was after or just before the campaign. He does this call with President Trump. He essentially says, as soon as this election's over, I'll commit to sitting down and negotiating a trade and security agreement. And that essentially buys Trump's silence
Yep.
for the next several weeks. And as I said earlier, it enabled Trump because he committed to enter in negotiations but didn't pre-negotiate any specific details. It enabled the president to have a conception of what an eventual deal looked like that was the most favorable in his mind. There
Yep.
were no trade-offs at that point. And I think that's what we saw play out in the past few days, both with President Trump, but also with the provincial premiers. At this stage, they can each in their own minds envision a deal that protects and advances their interest without having to make compromises on the others. At
Yep.
some point, though, we're going to, the rubber is going to hit the road,
Yep. Exactly.
and those trade-offs are going to manifest themselves. I think it's going to create tensions within the Confederation. It's also, incidentally, going to create possible tensions between Mark Carney and President Trump. And in the face of those issues, it'll be fascinating, as I said earlier. Does Mark Carney continue to get the treatment that he got this week, or does he start to get the Chrystia Freeland treatment?
Yes.
I think that's a big open question.
Daryl Bricker, a friend of yours, friend of mine, he's on the podcast regularly, and of course, does work with you guys at the Hub as well. Wrote one of those morning after pieces talking about the fractures that are underlying all of this, despite the goodwill in the short term here. That if you ignore the fractures, they widen, and if you paper over them, they rupture.
Yes.
And he was talking about the fault lines that we saw in the course of the election. Huge gender differences, huge regional differences, rural, suburban, urban differences, old, longtime Canadians and new Canadians. Like, the list was endless. As you look in the rearview mirror a little, do you think the fractures are less than we thought or more?
Hmm. Hmm. It's a great question. How would I answer that?
I don't
One
know
that
because I'm
so
still looking at numbers too, right? About what
yes,
really happened, who voted for whom.
one of the ones that worries me the most and that doesn't get enough attention um, is the growing gender divide, particularly amongst young people.
Yep.
Um, it is uncomfortable to talk about the relationship between the sexes. It is now wrapped up in broader divisive conversations
Yep.
about identity and all the rest. human sexuality. But at the root, the relationship between men and women is pretty fundamental to the way we organize ourselves,
Do you think?
the way we structure our society, the way we continue our society. And there's always been differences on the margins when it came to the political preferences of men and women, but particularly amongst younger people, it is becoming much more stark. Young women are pretty overwhelmingly progressive, and younger men are moving in almost like a countercultural
Yeah.
conservative direction. Not necessarily because they're reading Edmund Burke and Frederick
No,
Hayek
no.
or
Yeah.
something like that. It's because, in a way, they're pushing back against a lot of the excesses of identity politics and, frankly, a kind of anti-masculinity that we
Yeah.
find
The
in a
Me
lot of
Too, the
our
DEI, the, yeah.
exactly. And it's one thing for them to have, different ballot box preferences. But I think there's evidence, Senator Wallen, that it's manifesting itself in more fundamental ways. We're seeing young people date less. We're
Yeah.
seeing young people get married later. We're seeing young people having less sex, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
As I say, these are uncomfortable issues. They're difficult to talk about, particularly in a political or public policy context. But I think they're ones that we need to understand because, in a way, they run deeper than who the next prime minister is or who your local member of parliament is. It speaks to the kind of basic foundation of
This
our
is the point.
society.
If you're not getting married or not having sex or not having children, then this actually impacts both housing and immigration issues and work.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch of connections, right?
So in that sense, the regional story is a well-known one. I mean, we've been
Yeah.
telling ourselves that story since basically Confederation.
Yeah.
The class one is interesting. It's manifesting itself in unique and different ways, and we've talked a lot about that at the Hub. The generational one, I mean, we saw in effect political axiom flipped on its head. Young people used to vote liberal, and old people used to vote conservatives, and we
Right.
saw that change. And so it'll be fascinating to see whether that was aberrant or whether that is a possible durable change in our politics. But the one that we seem to have the most difficulty talking about, and yet the one that in some ways is more fundamental because it transcends politics, is what has happened such that we're seeing this growing gulf between young men and young
Yeah.
women, and yes, there's a policy dynamic, but there's a cultural dynamic. There's the ubiquity of pornography and social media and all of these sorts of things that I do think we need to find spaces to have those conversations because they really are as I say, so fundamental.
Yeah. It was Lynn in my office after our last discussion when you were involved there with Trevor and with Daryl. It twigged her to go and get a page from Mr. Harper's last book, Leadership in the Age of Disruption, of course, where he talked about the somewheres and the anywheres,
Yes.
which are there too. The somewheres, people who are attached to community and church and family, and then the anywheres, the cosmopolitan, elite educated, which means they can live and work and travel anywhere they want. And that is also broader than just class and income.
Yes.
It's also about attitude and access, and it's pretty fundamental.
Yeah, well said. I'm an anywhere.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um, uh,
New
and I'm
York
raised.
part-time and,
Yeah,
raising a family and two
yeah.
incomes and yeah,
And my parents and my grandparents and my brother who live in Thunder Bay, they're somewheres.
yeah,
And one thing I spend a lot of time thinking about as we raise young children is how do we give them the upside of being an anywhere, without losing the rootedness and the perspective of being a somewhere. And I think that probably is not unique. That a lot of we live in a meritocratic society,
yeah,
and I think in a lot at its best that is the Canadian project. We
yeah,
and so a lot of people like yourself, grow up in different parts of the country and
yep,
in pursuit of professional ambition and their own unique cultural preferences or whatever, find themselves in different parts of the country, often our most dynamic cities. I think that's all healthy. I don't want to reverse that, of course, but it is something to be mindful of. How do we, in effect, balance that or build a bridge between the somewheres and the anywheres? If I can riff off that for a second, this is
Yep.
one thing that I'd love your opinion on this or perspective. One thing that I think is really interesting, and I think it in some ways help explains Pierre Poilievre's loss in Carleton, incidentally, is something that the economist Mike Moffat characterizes
Yep.
as drive until you qualify, which is to say, we're seeing a growing exodus out of our major cities, particularly of families who
Yep.
are leaving in the pursuit of housing affordability. A lot of these people are leaving those cities, Senator Wallen, with what I'd characterize as urban sensibilities, maybe even anywhere
Yep.
sensibilities. And what's fascinating to think about is as they leave those places and move to peripheral or adjacent communities, like, say, the riding of Carleton, do they change the politics of those communities, or do those communities over time change their politics,
Yeah.
if I could put it that way?
No, it's really an interesting question.
I think that if it's one of my best friends, him and his wife moved in the pandemic from Toronto to Cobourg, and
Right.
you can see the growing influence of Toronto urbanites on the landscape of Cobourg, including its amenities and
Oh yeah,
its
Starbucks and great restaurants and yeah.
exactly, and that's all upside, of course, in a lot
Yep.
of ways. But it is fascinating to see as the cultural influence of our big cities spreads further and further, thinking about the political implications over time is something I like to kind of speculate about.
Well, it is because this is in I want to come back to what you think is gonna happen here because you've spent your life looking at the Conservative Party from all angles. Look, it's devastating on a human level for a leader to lose his riding and go through this process now of having to go through a by-election and end up back in the House. But it's going to change the nature of the debate because a lot of things are going to happen before he even gets there.
Yes.
But the what we did see, I think, was emerging. Who knows how long this will last? But certainly, voters left the NDP and joined the Liberals, and it became kind of the progressive, as we see in the U.S. with a two-party system, and the Conservatives, just by virtue of math, are never going to have as many voters or warm bodies attached as the combination of those two, right? So that is a pretty fundamental change unless something else radical happens. Where do you think we are on
Yeah,
that?
it's such a crucial question. I think on the episode we did right after the election, Daryl characterized it as a 60-40 dynamic. That if we
Right.
have a consolidated left and a consolidated right, the consolidated left is just bigger.
Yeah.
And nine times out of 10, in the absence of liberal scandal or some other
Right.
issue, that coalition is likely to win the election. If that analysis is correct, um, it leads you in a bunch of unconventional directions.
Yeah.
Should conservatives in Canada support proportional representation? Should we move away from these large consolidated parties and instead support a politics of fragmentation, where you would have kind of the dynamic creation of coalitions in different in different election cycles, depending on the circumstances. That's a painful conversation for a lot of people whose identity is wrapped up in the creation of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Yeah.
But that's one possible line of analysis stemming from that working hypothesis. Um, and then there's the open question about, I think we talked about on that episode, the Conservative Party's relationship with Quebec.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party has made successive attempts to try to make gains in the province of Quebec with pretty disappointing outcomes. That's come with trade-offs on the allocation of scarce resources. It's also come with trade-offs on programmatic or policy questions. Is there an argument that at some point the Conservative Party should take no for an answer,
Hmm.
and with that liberated in a way to position itself differently on issues that could be positive some in parts of English Canada. The best example is Bill 21.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party has had I think it's fair to say, ambivalent position on Bill 21, the Quebec legislation that prohibits people from wearing different types of religious uh, um, garments or whatever if they want to work in certain
Headgear. Yeah,
public
exactly. Yeah.
sector role. The Conservative Party remains disproportionately the political home of people of faith in the country, and there is something peculiar about that party staying essentially silent on what is the worst infringement of conscience rights and freedom of religion in in
Yep.
my lifetime. In a world in which the party essentially abandons its optimism about making these big gains in Quebec, does it enable it to come out in a more full-throated way against Bill 21? And if so, what are how does that affect the party's support in different religious minority communities in parts of English Canada? These are all terribly uncomfortable conversations. But as you say, if we are operating under the assumption that it's more likely than not that we are going to have two-party elections in English Canada, I think there is a pretty compelling argument that's the case,
Yeah.
then the Conservatives are going to have to do more than just make adjustments on the margins. They're going to have to figure out how they push their support up high enough that they can compete mano a mano against the Liberals.
And I come to it from my perspective as a Westerner. So we all know what's happening now. We're watching Daniel Smith, and people have very different views of her. I think she's managing the politics at home that she has to manage at home, and that is not easy. We can ask
Yes.
Jason Kenney and other premiers that lost their job over those issues. And it's not, and I'm not waving the Western separatism threat because I think that's a smaller group, but the disconnect from this country and the feeling that if that progressive group is always going to win elections, I'm taking this to its simplest point, and that it's never going to be able to have that serious conversation about energy and climate and representation because if you criticize, if you say you're in favor of energy development, you're a climate denier. And this stuff is not true. It
Yes.
isn't how people see it, but that divide, I mean, I'm talking to people at home who are saying, if Alberta holds that vote, hey, I'll be heading west. I want to be in that tent, not out of that tent. You know, uh, like this is a genuine concern, and I'm trying not to use the word threat because we've lived with 40 years of the separatist threat from Quebec, and it's a different issue, but it is a breakdown of the reason we're all strung together here along the 49th.
Yeah. Yeah. At the precise moment that Quebec was um, threatening separation, Quebec found itself consistently disproportionately represented around the table of the
Right,
national government.
right.
Those of the Prairie Province have precisely the opposite issue. That is to say, they have in successive elections consistently and overwhelmingly voted conservative. In this election, what Alberta, it was north of 60%. I'm afraid I don't
Mm-hmm.
remember
Yeah,
precisely what the Saskatchewan numbers were. And yet,
pretty much.
voters in the rest of the country essentially undid or vetoed their political
Yeah,
preferences. Now, that's how first past the post works.
works. Exactly.
Uh, but, one could get to a point where it seems to me Albertans and Saskatchewanians say this isn't working for us.
Yeah.
That a world in which there is this structural impediment to the expression of our political preferences in the national government, then why are we doing this? Like, how is this? And one of the things that really bothered me during the campaign is that, well, in Quebec, um, Mark Carney essentially says Quebec has a veto over national pipeline
Yeah.
projects. If you just think about that for a second, Senator Wallin, it really does bring into question the utility of a province like Alberta being part of Canada. If if in order to get projects done, Alberta's going to have to enter into some type of negotiation with different provinces along the route, then why not bother? Why bother being part of Canada? Why
Right.
not do that as a separate country, entering into jurisdictional arrangements with other jurisdictions
Yeah.
with whom you have to do business? The whole point of Canada, the whole reason we had Confederation, the whole reason we created a national government, which is really the only new entity or institution that comes out of Confederation, was that the national government would be responsible for overcoming the parochialism of
Exactly.
individual subnational jurisdictions. And so for Carney to say Quebec gets a veto, it brings into question, in a way, the whole purpose of Canada, the whole purpose of a national government. In that case, and I'm not saying this to be hyperbolic. Like, I think if you just thought about that answer dispassionately, you would say, well, Alberta might as well be an independent country. It would not have to share its resources through the federalism system.
Yeah.
Instead, it would enter into dispassionate commercial arrangements with jurisdictions with whom it has to build pipelines through.
Yeah.
And it would do that or not do that. But it really does strike at the heart of like the basic purpose of the national government. The national government has to speak up for the national interest. It exists to overcome the narcissism of small differences that is inherent to a collection of independent subnational jurisdictions.
So where this is both a question about what the prime minister does, how the premiers respond. We're kind of full circle to where the emphasis goes, because is it going to be in question period in the afternoon? I mean, Mr. Polyev had his finest hours doing battle with Justin Trudeau in the House of Commons, but that's kind of no longer the focal point when
Yes.
you've got a key player that's in extraterritorial negotiations there, and you've got, premiers that are engaged in that process of negotiating with one another to protect their own interests, which is also their job.
Yes.
So it's kind of like the structures are shifting, and I don't think anybody really knows how that's going to work. We've got this first
Exactly.
minister's process because we are a pretty decentralized country in that sense. But does Parliament become a little more irrelevant in the next little while?
Possibly. I think the outstanding question is how responsive Prime Minister Carney is to his large Quebec caucus, which ultimately enabled him to become prime minister. If
Yep.
were it not for the major gains that he made in the province of Quebec, he would not be the prime minister today. We'll have a Quebec election in 2026. There's a reasonable high probability the Parti Québécois wins that election. And so I suspect what Mark Carney is going to overwhelmingly hear from his Quebec caucus is that he needs to tend to Quebec interests and Quebec needs in order to try to minimize the risk of a PQ win and a possible referendum sometime down the road.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I think, I think you said when we spoke last, the famous Keith Davey line,
Yeah.
you take the rest
Yeah.
you have the rest and we'll take the rest. And one can't help but think that even notwithstanding Prime Minister Carney's best intentions, that type of thinking comes to be conveyed in his government's policy agenda.
Just before we wrap up, I do want to hear you on the state and future of the Conservative Party. And I'll start this way, like kind of which camp you're in, if I can, did we witness campaign malpractice, to quote Corey Tenike, or is there really a need for seismic changes inside the party that's a legitimate request?
Let me try to answer it this way. Um, you've been in a parliamentary caucus before.
Hmm.
I I don't like that Polyev preempted yesterday's conservative caucus meeting by both securing a riding, um, I think prematurely, and putting out his spokespeople like now interim leader Andrew Scheer to
Yep.
essentially establish the narrative that that there only marginal changes or marginal adjustments are needed to how conservatives go about trying to win the next election. There's something uh, incompatible with, on one hand, endorsing the Reform Act, which the Conservative caucus did yesterday, and on the
This is a
other
way to
hand,
challenge the leader inside the party. And yeah,
exactly, and on the other hand, Pierre Poilievre taking steps to essentially turn the caucus meeting into a fait accompli. And I do think it reflects something bigger and deeper about him as leader, a kind of inability to make himself vulnerable, an inability to give up control a bit. Would there have been that much downside, Senator Wallen, for there to be uncertainty over his future through the weekend
yeah,
into Tuesday's meeting, when he could have genuinely subjected himself to the judgment of his parliamentary caucus, and in my mind, come out of that, he would have gotten the same outcome, because I
yeah,
think there's strong likelihood that he would have had the caucus's endorsement, but they would have done it in a way where he, as I say, gave himself up to them in a way and exposed himself to their judgment. Instead, what he did was essentially preempt that kind of conversation, insist on kind of maintaining control. And I think that's kind of, in a way, if I can put it this way, the worst aspect of his leadership. Um, you know,
and it doesn't deal with the issue. We've got an awful lot of people who lost their seats or the
yes,
opportunity to be part of the Parliament of Canada because of the campaign.
that's right. And I just think, like, the 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 tendency to that kind of control and lack of vulnerability um, was at the heart of a lot of the challenges that Poilievre had during the campaign. Like I hate to use anecdotes, but I was talking to my grandma,
Hmm.
who just said, like, everything he says feels manufactured. Everything he
Yeah,
says feels um, um, like I'm not having a kind of genuine insight into what he thinks, or how I do think it is the way he handled this caucus meeting could be just dismissed as a one-off, but in some ways it strikes at the heart of a bigger challenge that Mr. Poilievre, notwithstanding his great instincts towards organization and political tactics and policy and all the rest, just needs to, like, open himself up a bit
yeah.
and open
The
up.
the video that he and Anna did, the "I'm sorry, but we're going to have a new day" video, he even reverted to the same lines, right?
Yes,
You're going to have a great house on a great street with,
yes.
like it was, you just wanted something human. Just, this has been gut wrenching, but I'd like another shot,
Do you
something.
remember? Do you remember during the debate, Senator Wallen, the very last English debate, and Eon's Steve Paikin asks them what their biggest regret was?
Right.
What happens if Pierre Poilievre would have said, one of my biggest regret is that it seems pretty clear that, on balance, Canadians trust him more than me on the Trump question. I don't know precisely what has
Yeah.
caused that. I'd like to tell myself that it's not true, but the polling is pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I regret that they think that, because here's why I think I'm the right person to
Yeah.
defend and advance Canadian interests. That would have been so counterintuitive, so
Yeah.
off-brand, so unlike his tendency to revert to this kind of prefabricated
Yeah.
way of communicating, that I think it would have. But I just don't think he even. It's not obvious that he has that in him.
Yeah.
And just more broadly, like, we had a really outstanding exclusive interview this week at the Hub with MP Jamil Javani, where he
Yeah.
talked about his relationship with JD Vance, his criticism of the Ford government. It's an outstanding exchange. And you know what, Senator Wallen? It made me kind of sad, if I can say, because it was a window into the type of exchange that we could have with conservative parliamentarians if the system would just permit them to
Yeah. Yeah.
to first of all interact with the media and others, and secondly, like, open themselves up a bit, make
Yeah.
themselves vulnerable. So that's a very long way of saying I think that Mr. Poilievre can make a compelling argument that he ought to stay on as leader. You know, the story out of the 2025 campaign, I think on balance is a good one. But my biggest fear is that the way that he's handled this caucus meeting, which, as I say, on the face of it, may not seem like that big deal, actually strikes at the heart of like something more fundamental about the way he does politics
Yeah, no, it's
and
a
his
very
relationship to
interesting
the caucus and the
assessment. Yeah.
relationship to the public. And it's a sign that he may not be capable or interested in making some of the adjustments to kind of open himself up and let people kind of in on who he is, what makes him tick, and where he wants to take the country.
I'm telling you, having spent a good chunk of my lifetime in front of a television camera, I've got to say that the public is absolutely the best judgment of who you are and if you're being real.
Yes.
You can't make it up on this medium where people have an instinctive response, and so I think you've really touched on something there that should be and obviously will be part of the assessment. Always love these conversations, Sean. We kind
Well,
of range broadly and madly around everything.
yeah,
It's,
let me know the reaction you get, Senator, to our conversation about young men and women not having
I
enough
know,
sex.
I
There's a
know. I
there,
look, I,
there's a headline for the YouTube video. I suspect the algorithm will like that.
but it's also really true, and it is also, important that we have these discussions. But you're right. You're right. It may just grab all the headlines, and that'll be good. We'll all get more clicks in this world. Sean, so great of you to do this. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sean is the editor at large of the Hub. And for those of you who, you know what, let's just talk about that for 5 seconds because, this is one of the new digital responses that is providing a different alternative than the mainstream media, the old newspapers. And you guys have made quite a point of saying we're not taking all these government subsidies. That's a whole topic for another day about the legislation that's now in place because people who live off subsidies from the government are not inclined to bite the hand that feeds. That legislation probably won't be undone now. So we're in a whole new world. Can you survive it?
I think so. Yeah. We have a increasingly diverse funding base that
Yeah.
comes from what we characterize as reader revenues, so subscriptions and one-off contributions from readers. We have a growing advertising and sponsorship business line. And so, yeah, we'll be fine. But it does feel, um, it isn't a great feeling to know that we are in this asymmetric competition
Yeah.
with others in the marketplace um, who are able to draw on a combination of direct and indirect government subsidies
Yeah. It was
that
the
can be
private sector for many years dealing with the CBC who got the
yes,
subsidies and also were allowed to go out and compete for advertising, and then the private
yes,
operators that only had one source.
yes. Yeah, I'd welcome the chance to come back on and talk about.
Yeah,
I mean,
we'll do
you
that.
mentioned the kind of risk of independence and so on. I think that's true. But in my mind, Senator Wallin, I think this will resonate with you. It'll probably resonate with a lot of other with audience members. Is that it it impedes the incentive for these outlets to try to figure themselves out. Like if 50% of your journalistic costs are being now defrayed through a combination of direct and indirect subsidies, for all intents and purposes, mean that it's a failed business model.
Right.
And yet the problem is a lot of these outlets are not trying to save themselves. You know, their website's still the same it's always been.
Yeah.
The writers are the same. The content's the same. If you and I were running a business that had essentially failed, we would be fighting like hell to try to make it survive. And the
Yeah.
consequence of these subsidies is it in a way kind of freezes them in a moment in which if left to the market, they would fail.
Yeah.
And I think in a way that is the most corrosive aspect of these subsidies. It is blunting the market incentive to survive.
Yeah.
And in a way that is our kind of secret sauce at the hub. We can't afford to stop or we won't survive.
Yeah.
and we take that seriously.
We are gonna do that. So you will come back very soon, and we'll have that conversation with other players in the field
I'd like
too.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. That's great.
Take care. Always good to talk to you, Senator.
And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you very soon.